efforts made to prevent that. They continue at this moment. One major effort was the establishment of NATO. Its official purpose was to protect Europe from Russian hordes, but a major purpose was to ensure that Europe would stay under U.S. control. That's a very live issue today. That concern, NATO, in fact, has expanded. Its role has expanded. I'll come back to that. Expanded again this morning, in fact, if you read this morning's newspapers. This conception of Europe as a potential independent force is tempered by a certain degree of contempt. Just a few days ago, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, his long government service, wrote an article called Goodbye Europe. It was saying, well, Europe has lost its role as a high-ranking power. The main reason is it's not violent enough. Europe has lost its traditional understanding of the values of brutality and conquest and savagery. It's now too peaceful, and it's not an appropriate partner. So goodbye, Europe. You're not fulfilling your role. We then move into what's called the Cold War period. Again, there's doctrine and there's fact. The doctrine about the Cold War, you know. We learn more about its reality from the actual events. The actual events of the Cold War were U.S. intervention and subversion throughout the Grand Area, the region of U.S. control. It's most of the world. And the justification for the intervention and subversion was the Cold War. We have to defend ourselves from the Russians. And Russia was pretty much the same in its much smaller domains. From the Russian point of view, the Cold War was, the actual acts of the Cold War were intervention and subversion and control within its Eastern European domains. So in reality, the Cold War was a kind of a tacit compact between the two superpowers that they would act freely without too much disturbance from the other in their own domains, but would leave each other alone. It didn't always work, but it in fact came very close to global war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that was the leading principle. Now, within U.S. domains, the main concern was what is officially called the domino theory. It might more accurately be called the mafia principle. International affairs is very much like the mafia. The godfather, the man in charge, does not accept disobedience. Disobedience is much too dangerous. Even the smallest storekeeper cannot refuse to pay protection money. And he has to be smashed and destroyed so that others don't get the idea that they can get away with it too. You want to maintain discipline, you have to ensure that disobedience is not tolerated, even in the smallest place. And that's a major theme of international affairs right until the present. Actually, Iran is again an analogy. Why is Iran considered such a major threat? Well, we can read in official U.S. documents. It's a threat because first of all, it could become a deterrent to U.S. action, to freedom of U.S. action. The U.S. must be free to invade other countries, to overthrow governments, and so on. And Iran, if it becomes independent, especially if it gets a nuclear deterrent, that could be a deterrent to this. So being a deterrent is unacceptable disobedience. Of course, the fact that Iran overthrew the U.S. imposed government is already unacceptable disobedience. The other charge against Iran is that it's attempting to extend its influence to neighboring countries. So it's attempting to extend its influence in Iraq and Afghanistan, maybe elsewhere. And that's intolerable. The United States isn't interfering when it invades those countries. It's protecting them. That's a principle of empire. So the U.S. doesn't intervene anywhere. But if Iran tries to extend its influence to its neighbors, that's aggression, unacceptable interference. Again, a typical theme of imperial policy, very striking in the U.S. policy for the last half century. Well, meanwhile, as I said, the grand areas become more diversified, became tripolar. Today it's diversifying even more. Latin America, for the first time in its history, is moving towards a degree of independence. South-South relations are being established. So, for example, China is now the major trading partner of Brazil, the most important country in South America. That's new. More generally, there's very common talk these days about a shift of power, a global shift of power, with China and India becoming the rising world powers, maybe Brazil on the side, and so on. If that were true, if China and India did become the centers of world power, that would be a return to the days prior to European imperialism, back to, say, the 17th century, when they were indeed the industrial and commercial centers of the world. It's not a very accurate picture. There is a shift of power, but it's not between states, really. There's a shift of power from the global workforce to transnational capital, and it goes worldwide. China is part of it. China is basically a huge assembly plant using very cheap labor for an Asian production system. So the parts and components and high technology move into China from the more advanced industrial societies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan particularly. They're assembled in China, then exported mainly to the United States, also to Europe. American producers are doing the same things. Major computer companies and so on will shift their production to China to use the cheap labor force, the horrible working conditions, and so on, then export back to the United States. U.S. economy because they hold so much debt, so much of the U.S. debt. Well, actually, the biggest holder of U.S. debt is Japan. And that doesn't give them any leverage in world affairs because it's not a powerful instrument. The trade deficit with China is huge, but again, that's an economist's kind of construction. The trade deficit with China has gone up, but the trade deficit with Japan and South Korea and Taiwan has gone down. And the reason is because China, those countries and Singapore, export to China the advanced parts and components of technology, which are then assembled in China, sent to the United States, and counted as Chinese exports. But if you look at the actual contributions, called the value added in the exports, it's mostly from the peripheral regions. In fact, the economists have calculated that if we did an accurate accounting of trade deficit, the trade deficit with China would go down maybe 25 or 30%, and it would rise to Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. So what we have is a major production. There's a major production center with an assembly plant in the middle of it called China, but the producers from Asia and the outside are providing the more advanced components of this, as are producers in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe. Well, that's a significant change. And globally, the percentage of income, of wealth that goes to the workforce is declining almost everywhere. In fact, it's declining in China more rapidly than most other places. On the other hand, wealth is being heavily concentrated internationally in transnational capital. Well, it's an old story. It's not the first time it's happening. It's taking new forms, and it's being accelerated by the international trade agreements. The international trade agreements are called free trade agreements, but that's a misnomer. That's not what they are. They're really investor right agreements, and they do